Perfect. Alrighty. And my name is Denise. I'm a senior program manager with the Learning for Equity team. I'll pass it over to Glenda to introduce herself.
Thank you, Denise, and welcome again, everybody. This is our third Friday training for the incubator for the participatory grant making process. My name is Glenda Linares, and I'll pass it on to Dr. Maxwell.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm super excited about this session and excited to have you all in the space. And let me see, I will pass it over to, I think that's it from our team. So I'll pass it over to Gabby McCullough. She is part of our Mockingbird Analytics, their consultant group that we work very closely with. So I'm excited to introduce you all to her.
Hello, everyone. Very excited to be here. At the top of this talk, I want to say I see program development and program evaluation as two sides of the same coin. We have to know the goals and objectives we're trying to achieve in order to measure the extent to which we've gotten there. So we're going to be talking a little bit about both today. We might be putting some fancy words to the amazing work you're already doing, might raise some new questions. That's great. We're here to talk through everything wherever you are. We can dive into the presentation. Let's head to the next slide. So a little more about me first. I'm a research associate at Mockingbird Analytics. I support organizations in evaluating their programs and help them use data to guide decision making. My background is in neuroscience and public health, with a focus in biostatistics and epidemiology. I'm formally trained in program evaluation, initially for health policy and now a little bit wider than that. My background includes harm reduction research and a lot of mixed methods evaluation. And our overarching goal with all of the folks we work with is to do what we can to advance their vision for transformative change. So we do a lot of thinking with organizations about why we're collecting certain data, collaborate with our partners to ask meaningful questions, and translate all of the findings that we gather into meaningful next steps. We have a fairly small group. If we can hold questions till the end, and I'll also have some punctuated time just to ask for some touch points, that would be great. But feel free to pop them into the chat as they come into your head. Just know I see them, I want to answer them, but just want to make sure that we can get through everything we want to cover today. Now, let's head on into learning goals for this workshop. First, we want to identify the foundations of trauma-informed program development. Second, examine a new model framework of trauma-informed research and evaluation practice. And then third, start thinking about how to design a trauma-informed evaluation practice for your work. Really, everything is about returning the focus to the people and communities you serve. That's how we view evaluation. Can we head to the next slide, please? So with SMARTY goals, just a quick check-in. Has anyone heard of SMARTY goals before? Have y'all worked with them before? Feel free to pop it. Not yet. Nice. Yolanda, sounds like you have. Andrea, same with you. Mary, it's a-okay that the answer is no right now. We'll go through everything still. Sounds like we've got a mix. Like I said towards the top of the presentation, good evaluation starts with a strong understanding of program goals and objectives. So we need that clarity in order to be able to measure what we're measuring. So SMARTY goals help us do that. It's an acronym that stands for strategic, measurable, ambitious, realistic, time-bound, inclusive, and equitable. Basically, what this does is it allows us to help start quantifying the goals that we're making. It's great to say, I want to help unhoused populations. Amazing start. How are we going to do that? What kinds of help are we doing? And that's also where Bloom's taxonomy is a nice complement. I've included Bloom's taxonomy of learning objectives because I think they're the absolute most useful way to structure either goals or objectives, because these are how we make statements about what we're trying to accomplish in our program goals. It explains the process of learning, this triangle, where before you can understand a concept, you have to remember it. Before you apply it, you have to understand it. And so each step adds on to the next one, and it helps us create a better understanding of our own goals and in order to evaluate a process. You must have analyzed it. So thinking about program evaluation as that second to top tier, we need all of these different components to line up first before we can start thinking about evaluation. In the little boxes that complement these words, you've got some great language that you can use to just start pulling goals. For instance, do you want to argue that the best way to help unhoused folks is long-term, low-barrier permanent housing? That allows us to set our goals with an understanding of everything that has to come before. We want to tailor goals and objectives to the level of engagement. If participants are brand new to the concepts you're organizing around, it might be better to keep things kind of lower middle pyramid. But if we're doing higher order learning, then we can aim for those higher top tier moments. You kind of want to meet your audience where they are to avoid any confusion or frustration. And similarly, if your team is pretty advanced, you want to make sure that you're challenging in a good way and pushing them forward. So if they already know, say, violence interruption, we want to help them apply and analyze tactics for gender-based violence interruption through more actionable workshops and practices versus just being able to define or classify what gender-based violence looks like. I know this might be a new idea for folks. Any questions here, or can anyone come up with an example of what one goal might be using Bloom's taxonomy? Totally okay if not. All of the goals we set towards the top of the workshop are good examples of how to use Bloom's, and it takes some thinking sometimes to start incorporating this. There are no more questions. Let's head to the next slide. So when we're thinking about program design, I'm inclined to think about the historical pitfalls to program design. Internally, we can't transform our worlds if we aren't doing the work internally as well as externally. So traditional program design doesn't typically address intersectional challenges to harm. One of my favorite sayings for restorative movement work is solidarity, not charity. If we're thinking about how the nonprofit sector started, it wasn't quite rooted in that idea. A lot of it started as charitable tax write-offs for rich folks. So thinking about how to challenge that within our program design becomes empowering and part of an important part of the work. And so in program design, I like to think about how the system is designed right now what kinds of harms it's created as a result of prioritizing charity over solidarity, and then how to correct those power imbalances. Um, Say, rather than one group handing down decisions, making those decisions independently and handing them down, what does it look like if instead we're focusing on sharing common goals and honoring lived experience and lived expertise? Um, it's a lot more about sustained relationships and building community and sharing power that can start to challenge these historical structures of program design. The trickle-down approaches that we see don't typically work anywhere. And so again, that community empowerment piece is important here. Um, in my own experience, I think one of the things I encourage folks to interrogate about their programming is, are we seeing education as a replacement for legislation and advancing work? Or is education a piece of that, where if you have an action piece in research and programming, if you're also doing advocacy, you can partner all of these into something that's a lot more compelling. So putting it back in terms of evaluation, evaluation results are good. It's great to educate yourself about what's working with your programming. It's wonderful to learn what your strengths are, where you're challenged, but what's better, and something that I might think about in terms of program design and evaluation design, is taking evaluation results that can then be used to do something tangible, to make a tangible difference. So, as much as evaluation is sometimes something we see as a mandatory grant requirement, as something we see as something we have to do in order to satisfy a funder's request, a lot of it too is about our own learning and how we can make changes within our programming, within the advocacy work we're doing, within our organizations, to actually create tangible change in the way that we want to see it happen. Can we move to the next slide, please? So, how do we take this historical understanding of program design, the knowledge that it's carried some harms through to present day, and create trauma-informed approaches? Um, I love Watson's saying here, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. This is really at the core of community-based work and also of trauma-informed approaches. We'll talk a little bit about trauma first when we move to the next slide, please. So just so we have a community definition as we're working with this today, I like this definition from Dr. Gabor Mate and Samsa: physical and psychological stress reactions resulting not from what happens to you, but what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. This definition of trauma I like because it honors that same thing can happen to a bunch of different people, but the way that we process it differs. We're all unique individuals. It's not just about one event itself. It's that internal experience and the lasting events, the lasting effects on someone's psyche and body because of those experiences. Can we move to the next slide, please? So now that we understand trauma, here are some guiding principles to a trauma-informed approach. It's not a checklist, it's an iterative process. We're constantly working to figure out what works best. And it's a process of learning and deepening our connections to community and context, both in history and today. We integrate into our designs, our programs, and visions these principles to ground us in hope for what can be achieved tomorrow. I'll read, well, a little bit of context. This list is adapted from Center for Disease Control definitions of trauma and harm reduction. And each of these concepts overlap a little bit, but we'll talk through them as discrete units and then we can kind of see how they come together. So the first concept is safety. Spaces feel true and supportive emotionally and physically. A challenge here is safety means really different things depending on what community we're in, right? There are some spaces that a friend might feel safe in and a different friend might not. And so safety is really community defined. It's something that as we're working within a community, we can ask them directly, what is safety to you? And that can help us define and identify how we can uphold that. The next is trustworthiness and transparency. When we're working in communities with a lot of trauma, need for trust can be a matter of survival. Um, Depends a lot on who you're working with, but trust can be increased through added transparency throughout the program design and evaluation process, through radical honesty. Things like finances are usually pretty public for nonprofit organizations, but thinking about how you can make your program development process transparent, making your evaluation process transparent, it really builds trust when you can be as open as possible with how you're coming to the decisions that you're coming to. Um, Again, this is very community forward. Creating long-term change to solve these problems is by being collective, not only in outcomes, but in the process of how you're getting to those outcomes too. Then we've got peer support. We want to ensure that those we work with and support have opportunities to create community. Working in isolation is really hard and it doesn't help a lot of the time, and it counters that ethos of collectivity and it can hinder trustworthiness. So working collectively, working as a community, supporting our peers can be a really effective way of both creating safety and trustworthiness. And that bridges nicely into collaboration and mutuality. We're all part of communities. It's so important to make the process of design and evaluation collaborative within those spaces. We're working with people, and at the end of the day, we want their input about how we're going about doing that. So, voice and choice, similar concept, community ownership of the organization, of the work. So, things like term limits for turnover can help create constantly new voices and a freshness rather than having antiquated ideas coming in. Advisory boards are another amazing way to do this. Alumni work, where folks who have been through the program have opportunities to contribute to its development, are another great practice. For voice and choice, it really is a question of how do we integrate community agency and self-determination to guide the work that's being done. That brings us into cultural, historical, and systemic issues. We're in the work we do, we carry the history of that work with us. Sometimes that can be a good thing, standing on the shoulders of giants. Sometimes that can be wrapped up in intergenerational trauma. And so understanding our own wounds and how those might create blind spots or superpowers for us as we're developing programming and evaluation is so important. Solidarity is about safety. No one wants to be a charity case. We want to feel united. And that's part of the psychological and emotional healing from the structural harm that can be so isolating. So, creating conditions of agency and interdependence is critical to counter that here. All of these trauma-informed approaches really appreciate that at the core, the people who we're working with know what's best for them. And so then our work as community leaders is to reduce those barriers for people to claim their power. I want to take a quick pause here and see if we've got any questions.
I'll ask a question. Maybe
Yeah.
that's kind of a question others may have. How do you apply trauma-informed approach to research? How do you build that into your research plan? Yeah.
So that's actually the very next slide. So thank you for that transition, Chandel. There we go. So to design a trauma-informed process, there's not a specific recipe. It's also the knowledge that as people, we're constantly learning and growing, and we're going to make mistakes along the way, and it's just learning from those. So we have this loose process for designing trauma-informed programming. This cycle is a big way we envision the world through the framework of program design. Realistically, you can start anywhere. I have the first slot as relationships because I think starting in community, you start with a lot of momentum, a lot of power, and you have an opportunity to build trust that can impact your ownership over the space, over the work you're doing. Um, for relationships, at the core, we rely on building those deep, trusting relationships with our teams, with the communities we serve. And it's the heart of any transformative movement for justice are those deep relationships. If you're starting from scratch, it looks like building relationships and trust with community members. So I would always see what context we're working in, look at the ecosystem, the relevant stakeholders, who's doing work that's complementary, and then if you're trying to create additional programming, speaking with them about program gaps, about places where your work can really complement what's already happening in the community. If you're reevaluating an existing program, think about the kinds of relationships you have and if new relationships should be cultivated. So we're all working within these communities, within their ecosystems, understanding community context and being willing to create new relationships, create new pathways, and constantly thinking about where are their gaps? What what is my community telling me they need? And working from there is why relationships are such an essential part of designing a trauma-informed process. The second step is a nice complement, knowledge building. For new programs, this is particularly important. Again, just like asking your community members, asking folks who are already steeped in the work, what do you need? Conducting a needs assessment can be a really good way of garnering community input. It's one thing to see a problem sort of from the outside and think that you have a solution, but a lot of times we're working on assumption until we're really steeped in the work and learning about that larger ecosystem at play. As a quick example, we worked with a client who was in a Washington, D.C. neighborhood that had the highest maternal mortality rate in the country. Instead of just unilaterally deciding on a solution, she actually went door to door and spoke with moms, spoke with prenatal caregivers within the Black community who taught her about the importance of doulas for reducing mortality rates. So if you just do that, maybe you're thinking, oh, doula support program, let's build community and sustain these doulas. But she actually went to the doulas themselves and learned that they already had the community. It was already there. It was actually, they just needed funds to sustain themselves. And so she set herself up to start a guaranteed basic income program for the doulas, innovating from those evidence-based practices and gathering that knowledge and making sure you're speaking to all of the stakeholders is such a critical form of research that can be fundamental for developing really impactful programs. And so defines evidence and expertise we're going to talk about very soon. In my opinion, you're almost definitely already doing it with a research justice lens, but I'm super excited to talk about that in just a few slides. Finishing out our circle here, collective care and power. Through those relationships, through shared struggles, we come together to make a plan for developing and sustaining power towards shared visions. It's important to bring people back to the table to discuss more nuanced ways to address challenges based on those honest relationships we've built. For innovation and adaptation, it's really important to acknowledge fears and what's shaped people's responses to past efforts. It it helps us understand how to move forward to understand where we've been. And then continuous improvement. I'm a big fan of thinking about how we can take feedback and use it to make ourselves better. Again, we're all works in progress. So are our organizations. All the work we do is just this beautiful process. And so when we see the work in action, we can use continuous feedback loops to adapt strategies and methods, respond to new challenges, avoid rigidity. There's so much change to navigate that having an eye towards consistent improvement, continuous improvement can be really beneficial as well. Um, Thinking back to actually, that's perfect. Um, Moving into any assumptions and experiences you have with research and evaluation as we move more into a discussion of evaluation. Are there folks who have had experience with research and evaluation, folks that have found things that really work, things that really haven't, any concerns you might have? And feel free to pop them in the chat if anyone would like to share. Difficult, yeah. What felt difficult about it? If you don't mind sharing more, Yolanda. Yeah. It is it's very difficult to know where to start. Let's move into the next and where to end. Yeah. It's hopefully some of what we're about to talk about will also help affirm some of those concerns about beginning and ending while also making them feel a little better. Let's move into the next slide. So, a framework that we rely really heavily on within our work is the idea of participatory action research. It has a lot of names. You might have heard it referred to as CBPAR, participatory research, experiential research, collaborative research, popular education. At its core, it integrates research with action for justice and equity. So it's rooted within Paulo Freire's pedagogy of hope. Um, and he was doing participatory research aimed at social transformation by building his teaching model around themes in his students' lives. Um, Teachers became more facilitators, guiding students as they collaborated to find solutions to community problems. A lot of what community-based research, participatory action research does is ensure that research and evaluation are sharing power with the communities that we're working in, and that the participation of the communities in question are are essential to our outcomes. So every participatory action framework really thinks about how you incorporate community knowledge and honor that that lived experience and also that action part, that the processes and outcomes are rooted in equitable practice and ultimately that we want something out of the research we're doing. We want some kind of actionable next step. You move to the next slide, please. So, why do we evaluate? I'm sharing the secondary reason first because I'd like it to be secondary, but it's often what catalyzes evaluation for the first time. For funding and impact reporting, that is why most nonprofits think to start to think about evaluation is you know you need it for grant reporting, you know that in grants you're writing, they want something about evaluation in there. And if you're going that route, that's totally fine. I totally hear that. That's a really good reason to start. But people who are funding you, ultimately they're funding you because they want to ensure that they're funding change efforts. It's okay to be a little bit critical with those funders so that you're ensuring also that there's equity in how you're evaluating. What I mean by that is often when we're thinking about reporting, some external agency has told the grant administrators what you need to collect. So you need demographic data, you need strict outcomes, you need proof of impact, is basically what they're looking for. The problem is all of these are coming top down and aren't necessarily community based. So you just want to be cautious that you and your communities aren't being exploited or you're not being scapegoated by the funder to be harmful at the expense of your communities. So if you're doing evaluation only for funding and reporting, I would encourage being empowered to disrupt funders' assumptions and how they're harming your communities. We were working with a client who was doing work with the UN, um, and the UN mandated that they go into the refugee camps that they were working with and ask the folks who were living there why they fled, what brought them to those camps. The UN didn't provide resources to support refugees as they were re-traumatized by recalling these experiences. And so the leader of this past client said no, they wouldn't allow the UN to monitor their participants. They told the other shelters to say no, and they all pulled out of this UN agreement, this UN funding, until they came up with a cohesive plan for support as they conducted the monitoring. And they still got funded down the line by the UN. And so it's a scary jump to make to say, hey, we're not doing that. That doesn't serve our community to a funder. But know that even though it's so hard and scary, it's part of our accountability to the communities that we're serving to say, hey, this evaluation, I understand that you want proof it works. This isn't the right way to do it. Um, so let's move into the next slide to talk about what I would like to believe is a great purpose for evaluating within nonprofits. We want to tell a story. We want to collect data and tell a story about what's working and about what needs improvement. So we're trying to make change over time. A deep evaluation is going to thoughtfully review the program in as much detail as possible. We're going to think about where it takes place, how often the program is conducted, who the stakeholders are, who's on the team, what are their relationships to the community and the work, what does lived experience mean among our leadership. So take a deep dive into everything that's going on is really our core goal of evaluation. How programs are delivered, how they're implemented, what kind of follow-up, everything about the larger context of that work being done is important to consider in evaluation. We can also think about history of the neighborhoods we're working in. Um, why is it important to do work there? Is it building on a legacy of action work or filling in a needed gap in that place? Um, Geography is so important to reporting on your work. Our places shape us and we shape them. And so thinking about how your work is happening within the spaces you're serving can also be a really, really strong tool for evaluation. It can be important to think about policies that led to the issues that you're seeing, that your program interrupts or mediates. Are there policies that could help solve some of the changes you're seeking to make? How? This can also help with that action step, that big takeaway from research, where once you start thinking about these things, maybe you're making policy briefs for lawmakers, you're going to town hall meetings to advocate for additional funds or for something structural. Policy analysis is a whole other process, but it is good to keep in mind because it can be important for shaping your programs, not just funding, but also physical spaces. Thinking about whether or not communities have green spaces and whether or not there are places that could become green spaces can really change, say, a program that's designed to help younger kids move. Um, at its core, evaluations should consider gaps and barriers as well as strengths and kind of unite all of those to create something that has actionable next steps. Thank you. So there's a third developing area of evaluation. Data is power. Documenting harm as well as struggles to resist harm can be really powerful within evaluation. So that historical documentation piece is also something that can create a lot of power within the spaces you're working with. Um, Nonprofits are critical for preservation and protection of data, especially when we have a government that doesn't believe in research and data anymore and is taking down databases left and right and erasing history. Knowledge of the past inspires radical futures, and a lot of what's being deleted and disappeared are things that empower communities. Um, James Baldwin says, history is not the past, it's the present. We carry our history with us. To think otherwise is criminal. We gotta know where we're coming from to dream up where we want to go. Um, and so thinking also about every evaluation that you write up as a piece of that history, as a way of leaving something behind for folks who want to do similar work to understand what's working and what's not, can be a really powerful addition to evaluation. Let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So there are 5 major approaches to evaluation. Oh, I think I saw a hand go up. Did someone have a thought?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So we've got 5 major approaches to evaluation. Beyond what tends to be the most straightforward way of evaluating programs, which are straight counts of how many participants, how many sessions did we hold. We can do formative evaluations, how and why a program is implemented, summative evaluations, which are reflective after a program ends, and I can ask participants whether they gained knowledge, shifted attitudes and behaviors, all of that good stuff. Process evaluations evaluate the program implementation and whether it was rolled out how we thought it would be. It's a much more internal evaluation that can be good, especially after pilot programs, to understand if there was a good amount of uniformity across programs, especially program delivery, especially. If there's a large network of providers, for instance, facility A might be doing things a little bit differently than facility B, which means that understanding how those differences in delivery are happening and why can also impact why different facilities have different results. So we can learn a lot from process evaluation. Outcome evaluation determines the effectiveness of a program in creating change. So something like how well are we achieving items identified in a strategic plan? And then impact evaluation thinks about, at its core, correlation versus causation. It assesses how outcomes can or can't be attributed to the program design, and it's both intended and unintended effects. Impact is really difficult to measure. We we want to design evaluation in a way where we're understanding if the outcome happened because of our programs or if our programs were just additive and it might have happened anyway. So that's that correlation versus causation understanding. Um, Depending on the setup and what we're studying, we might do things like randomized control trials or process tracing to look at causal mechanisms. I would definitely say that's a more advanced metric, but let's go ahead and move one more slide forward. So this is really, and Yolanda, I hope this is a helpful starting point. I think part of the reason it's difficult to know where to start and end is it's a big circle. So we're learning constantly. What we learn from our research can inform program design, and then it's it's all a circle. We're constantly thinking about how our research can transform into action, can transform into more reflection, can transform into more research. So um, it's so similar to program design processes too, and they're often linked, which is why we typically present them together. You've got your goals, and then you set a plan for how you want to improve over time. Um, we can use it as a way of IDing problems. We think of this as a research question. What questions do we have? What problems do we see? Um, all of those are good starting places for evaluation, is just creating a set of simple questions that can assess how well our goals are tracking. Um, in the interest of time, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So, like with program design, program evaluation has had a lot of history, good and bad. There's a lot of rigidity. Most people think surveys are the first and best way to understand evaluation. It hasn't been very creative. Surveys are great, it can tell us a lot, but there are so many other ways of assessing impact, of assessing how well we're achieving our goals that kind of get overlooked because of very structural systems and knowledge. Typically, evaluation has been very siloed. There isn't a lot of connection to the world outside. And so we always encourage an intersectional approach. Um, so something like gender-based violence linking to housing and childcare access. Traditional evaluation might not look at all of those linkages. And so we're constantly trying to imagine new ways to discuss and innovate within the work to ensure that our approaches disrupt the status quo and to gain new understandings because the world is always changing. Let's move into a quick discussion of data. This can also be a very intimidating question. What does data mean? Let's move another slide ahead and talk a little bit about it. I love this visual for a practice called research justice. On the left, you've got that very traditional structure under the today column that gives mainstream knowledge more political power. On the bottom, experiential, cultural, and spiritual knowledge typically is given less political power. So things like wisdom from long histories of leaders is typically given less power and less political power than the peer-reviewed research that comes out. Our vision for research justice, though, would mean that that same leader's wisdom, those same experiences that get shared, the community wisdom that gets passed down generation to generation is given as much of a stake at the table as those formal science articles, as experiential knowledge. And solidarity work centers the leadership and lived experience of those most effective, especially racial and gender minoritized people and leaders, in an effort to facilitate genuine, lasting social change through self-determination. This vision of research means that the community already has the expertise and knowledges, but it just might need support in leveraging it to disrupt harmful policies and institutional practices that reproduce inequities in research and policy and practice. So, all this to say, data can also look like participants' wisdom, like the advice that you're given as you're stepping into a leadership role from a previous leader. Um, we typically think of data as numbers, and I'm here to kind of encourage us to think outside of that and think also about the power of storytelling and the power of experience and the power of cultural knowledge. Let's go ahead and move into the next slide. So, just some shared definitions to make things a little more approachable. Data, we're talking about those discrete units of information that are most commonly seen as numbers, but again, like we just said, can also be words, sentences, phrases, wisdoms passed down. Outputs are the measurements that define um, how often we're serving people, who we're serving. Your organization has a lot of control over these numbers. Those are outputs. Outcomes are the measurable achievements that the program accomplishes because of the delivery of services, which we usually measure in either numbers or through stories, through narratives. And then affects versus effects. These are thoughtful descriptions of the ways programs enrich or enhance human experience as a result of a program, typically seen through some kind of narrative form, some kind of story. Let's move into data collection. We'll move one more slide as well. I've got, I think, a nicer summary on this one. So we have two main camps of data. Qualitative, these are our narrative pieces. We can ask questions like, did the program change participants' knowledge, attitude, or behaviors? What did participants learn or gain? What effects did the program have on participants' lives? All of these things that might be a little bit more story-oriented than the quantitative. So how many people participated? Demographic information about who participated, frequency of service delivery, where services were delivered, and then just in and out data. So something like supplies delivered are all things that fall under the quantitative category. Excuse me. The reality is the data you get depends on the methodology that you're using. So knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors might be descriptive in nature, but if you asked in a post-program survey where you're asking people to rate on a scale of 1 to 5, we can make that quantitative. We can make those numbers. And a lot of it is just up to how we want to evaluate, which can also be community led. It makes sense to do a Likert scale if we want a quick touch point with folks. Maybe that's not as good for people who don't have a lot of time or for people who would have difficulty taking the survey. And then we might want to incorporate other methods of asking how well our work is going. Let's move one more slide over. So some common methods of data collection, like I mentioned, pre and post survey programs. This means that we can measure things like, did people learn more over time? Folks might come in saying, I don't know very much about this topic, and come out saying, I learned quite a lot. We can also get more in-depth data from focus groups or listening sessions where we ask guided questions to help facilitate a conversation about what's working and what's not. Interviews are very similar. Those are typically one-on-one, whereas focus groups are multiple people. We can make observations. We can go and see how well, say, folks are moving through a facility that we just built. Are there points where there's a bottleneck? We can go out into the field and make observations. We can also do case studies. It's a deep dive into one example of the impact of your work. It's a great way to tell a story. We can do document and record analysis from secondary sources, so like literature reviews, archival data, and then finally institutional data. Those primary sources like public health and policing data can be really helpful for gathering additional facts and context that we might want to use in our reporting. Let's move to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, surveys aren't the only way of collecting that kind of knowledge. There are creative ways like calendars, like photo voice, dot voting that I'd be happy to talk more about a little bit down the road if there are other ways of assessing knowledge that you might want to learn about. All research methods have pros and cons, so it's just important to tailor them to your capacity, your interests, and your community's values and needs. So something like photo voice might be really good for young people. If you're working with teenagers, having them write survey responses over and over again might be really challenging, but having them take a photo once a week or take a photo that makes them that aligns with how they feel after being part of the program and give it a caption can be a really good way of collecting data creatively that means we're honoring what our communities need. Let's move to the next slide. I'll try and speed up some things as well. Really quickly, best practices for collecting data. Make sure your goals are clear. We want to use closed-ended questions as much as possible in surveys and open-ended questions in interviews. So we don't want to ask things like, how many years have you been participating? And then do a big text box. We typically want things in surveys to be pretty finite so we can make the data analysis easy, whereas that's a really interesting question that could garner a really lengthy response from someone in an interview. We don't want to double barrel questions. What that looks like is, did you have fun and learn something? Well, if I only had fun and I didn't learn something, how am I supposed to answer that? So separating out the different metrics we're interested in, super important. We don't want to double barrel. Use neutral expressions and plain language. We don't want to be overly wordy. Test your instruments. Ask your friends, your coworkers, community members to test your instruments and give feedback. Ensure respondent privacy by making sure you've got security in place, making sure you're not collecting anything too personal if you don't need it. Don't forget to obtain consent from minors and for sensitive info, and just across the board, informed consent is really important. Keep your data collection reasonable in length. You're much more likely to get thoughtful responses from a 5-minute survey instead of a 50-minute one. And then you might have heard them referred to as incentives for participation. I like to think of them more as compensation. You're paying someone for their expertise. They're sharing with you their thoughts and experiences, and it's important to honor that they're contributing to your knowledge as well. Um, let's actually skip past this one if that's okay. I know I'm right up against time. Um, am I okay to keep going with just a couple more slides? Or sorry, that was mostly a question for both the Rising Communities team and for the folks on this webinar.
Yeah, if everyone is okay with staying a few minutes longer, I'd say go for it. If you do need to leave, feel free to leave and we'll share the recording later, of course.
In that case, can we go back one slide to collecting data with communities?
Sorry, Gabby, what was the slide?
No
Which
worries.
one?
Collecting data with communities, I think it's one more, sorry.
That one?
That's perfect. Thank you. So these are some concrete ways to be generative in evaluation. Our favorite framework to use is called appreciative inquiry. Um, Basically, what it does is it asks questions in a way that helps us understand not just where we are, but how we know where we are. So, um, it's a strengths-based approach that helps us identify how we're having transformative effects. Sure, you want to name opportunities for growth and limitations, but this shows a thoughtful process for informing your decisions about effective program shifts and updates. It's meant to be a critical reflection to understand where you want to grow to better serve your communities. And sometimes scaling can mean deepening instead of going wider. So, appreciative inquiry, we dream, we think about what the ideal is, we design, we think about how to get there, and then we deliver. We implement suggestions and note where those ideas came from. We also want to be sure that we're holding systems accountable. Policies and systems, when we formalize things, we kind of risk creating conditions for interpersonal, institutional, and structural violence. We want to center those systems in our evaluations to hold them accountable for transformation change. Excuse me. Um, so you might want to add institutional context for evaluation you share to contextualize those findings. Um, Consent practices as well, mentioned that a little bit, but we want to avoid deficit-based language, allow storytellers to edit content, push back against required storytelling that is exploitative, address institutional reasons, and include corrections to the language in the narratives of reporting. So consent practices are going just beyond just agreements. They're allowing people who share the data to edit the content and co-create those narratives. It can be really important for unearthing trends that you might not see, particularly if you're serving a population where you don't have lived experience. Um, it's it's another way of sharing power with the communities that you're serving that can really honor that their experiences are at the center and a driving force of what you're doing. Let's move to the next slide, please. So you've done all this hard work. You've thought through where to start your evaluation. You've thought through the goals that you want to think about how well you're achieving. You've set a time period where you looked at your impact. You created an evaluation design. Now what? Well, disseminating the data can mean a lot of things. You can post reports to your website. You can share them as slides on Instagram for learning in the community. You can take them to conferences if you really want to present your findings. Um, all of these, all of these ways of disseminating the data are a way of sharing the fact that you put all of this work into understanding how your programming is working, understanding what you're doing and how it's working within your communities. Typically, within all of these, a good practice is, of course, to act on the findings with a reporting plan that structures what info that you'll disseminate and to who and how. Um, And so it might look like increasing partnerships and involving, say, an academic institute to involve students and teach them about your revolutionary work outside the classroom to mobilize future change agents. It might look like lobbying for policy that would support your communities. Um, how you report on your findings is going to be a little bit driven by what you want them to do. So, a 30-page report, really good internal document, can give some great context on what's working well for your team. For a funder, though, a nice, pretty, highly visual 3-page report is really useful. For policymakers, a leave behind packet of 5 pages might be more impactful than, again, that 30-page document, even if you have all of these results to report. So you can also selectively choose what part of your evaluation you want to highlight based on the groups and the goals that you're setting for the action you want to happen as a result of the evaluation. And again, this whole process is cyclical. So while we finish the research, we're transforming it into action. We'll reflect again and iterate, and maybe that leads to more research, more action, more reflection. So it really is a constant process. Let's move to the next slide. So what does an evaluation goal look like? Well, the evaluation goals should be first and foremost designed to meet the needs of the communities. So design and implement a community feedback process where services are regularly reevaluated. This can also incorporate the need to reflect the organization's desire to reduce and eliminate harm. These can all kind of connect together. You might hire lived experience staff to engage community and evaluation efforts. You might want to ensure that metrics are defined robustly through a lens of equity. That might look like update evaluation process to include policy analysis and get feedback on questions, framing, and language. You might want to embrace that changes in how we evaluate requires a flexible response for what we may not expect to learn, with the goal of designing a new method of evaluating impact. So
I thought you fell back to sleep.
So sorry, Delicia. Do you want to say that one more time? Okay. All of these major goals can
You
be
didn't go get, you forgot to get the little sand shit. What? The sand.
We'll need, there we go.
the major goal can be as creative as you want, with also the knowledge that evaluation can be a little messy. I would consider it more of an art than a hard science in a lot of ways. We can be creative with how we're collecting data, creative with the kinds of questions that we're asking, creative in evaluation design, where we don't need to hit all of these traditional metrics in order to have it be a really successful evaluation. Really, the most important thing for evaluation is thinking about how the questions that you're asking and the data you're collecting are going to help you better serve the communities that you're investing in. And as long as evaluation is doing that, that's really what matters the most. So that is everything I have for today. Thank you all for staying over. Yes, Donna, go for it.
Hi, thank you so
Hello.
much thank you for that presentation. I am so sorry this question. I just wanted to wait to the end. It was really to ask Glenda. I'm sorry. And Chandel, we were discussing with Glenda earlier about the local priorities for each area. And I know that there's 2 for Willowbrook Watts, reduce poverty and reduce housing insecurity. And I remember Dr. Shandell said that there was some additions to that. Is that still true? Or are those the only 2 priorities that we're supposed to pick from for our area? And that is my question. Sorry.
Hi, Miss Donna. So,
Hi.
hey, to Claire, and you're so right. It is kind of confusing, right? So,
Mhm.
to clarify, the proposal had the top two priorities based on the convening that we did on October 4th. So those
Mhm.
were preliminary priorities based on about 56 delegates from the different communities who voted on priorities. And so we needed to get that RFP out. So we went ahead and used that preliminary data to identify the top two priorities out of five that the community said that they was most important. What we're continuing to do is collecting additional votes on priorities with the greater community. So that's our get out the vote process that's happening right now. We're trying to hit 5,000 votes. And I think right now, in terms of like how many votes that count, we're under that. We're under 200. So
Mhm.
we are use that preliminary to base your
Okay.
proposal off of. That's the best advice I can give you right now.
Okay. No worries. As you know, we already qualify for both, but you can only pick one. That was the other thing? Okay.
Correct.
Just making sure. All right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you too.
Any other questions? I know some of you might have more specific questions about your organization and how evaluation might look within it. So I did want to share a Calendly link for office hours. I would be super excited to talk with anyone who has questions about what's on their mind, to help y'all plan out what an evaluation that works for you and your community. So please, happy to be a sounding board. Would love to hear more about the work you're doing. And um, also feel free to, is it okay to share my email if sometimes don't work for folks and we need some flexibility? Awesome.
And I'll just add that as we get further along, once we have our final applicants, everyone finalized that will become a grantee, we'll work through what that impact report can look like at the end of your program period. So that way everyone has a template to use and it helps makes this process of research and evaluation a little more simpler.
Thank you, Dr. Maxwell. And Denise put on the chat the reminder that the applications are due the 21st of November at 5 p.m. So happy that we've seen lots of progress made in the applications that are currently on Grant Vantage, and looking forward to you applying. Andrea?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. It's very interesting information. I really have learned a lot in these sessions. I would just like to clear one thing. I know Donna was asking about the priorities, and Dr. Shondell also said we're going to continue to clarify that even after we submit the grant if you're selected. Did I understand that correctly for the voted on priorities?
Oh, yeah, let me clarify that. So we're going to keep
Thank you.
collecting priority votes with with the greater community. So in the RFP, what was shared were the top priorities based off of our delegates voting on October 4th. And so those top priorities reflect a preliminary ranking of priorities. So you can move forward with what was put into the RFP.
Okay,
We
thank you.
Yeah. But we will share once we have more of what the greater community has voted on priorities. We will share that with everyone later, and it'll likely be maybe mid next month. Um, but that does not change, what your proposal is. It doesn't change it. We want to be able to hit all the priorities to some degree, so it doesn't change what you're working on.
Thank you. I really do appreciate that clarity because that was one of my concerns. I didn't
Mhm.
want to go in one direction
Right.
and then the day before you're like, uh-oh. Okay.
Right,
Thank you.
right. No, we're with you. Yeah.
Well, any other questions before I just say thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for your participation, and it was an honor to be here.
Thank you, Gabby. It was an honor having you.
Yes, thank you so much, Gabby, for being in this space with us. And folks, feel free to continue to reach out to us if you want to be part of office hours, either with Gabby or with other teammates from pricing committees. Thank you, Denise, Shandell, and our interpreter, Lorna. Hope everybody has a good Friday.